All right, joining us from Kingston, Ontario, Canada is Ian Garner. He's a historian. He's written extensively on Russian propaganda. He's also got a book out called Stalingrad Lives, the Stories of Combat and Survival. And Ian, you have another book coming out called Generation, how do you want to
Z.
pronounce it?
Z generation.
Z or Z, depending on where you're from, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth. And that's going to be released next year. So, even as we talk, the Russians have just banned public discussions on a wide range of information, since we're talking about information wars to a degree, right? So they now say that the classification of anything military is going, and releasing anything military detail is going to lead to a crime. And that includes things like, lots of armies do that in terms of troop movements or troop makeup or secret information about weapon systems. This is things like mobilization and civil defense topics, including the morale, crimes committed by members of Russian armed forces. Do you want to say anything about that?
I think when we read these stories in the West, we think, well, how odd that that should be the case, which essentially is what your question is. But the Russian government often uses legislation like this as a very broad instrument. So we can declare anything to do with the military is now forbidden. And the issue really is that the government always has the whip hand in deciding what does military really mean, which is what you've just outlined.
And they want a free hand to silence just about anybody that they don't consider to be friendly.
Exactly. And that's really what it boils down to, right? Anybody touching on any military topic whatsoever, and because of the way that the legislation is framed, anything can be military by definition, right? Because you could make the argument, and I'm sure we'll see this made in courts, that somebody makes a post about the lack of sugar in a store in wherever, Chelyabinsk, and says, the economy's not been going very well lately, has it? Well, hold on, isn't that a criticism of the war because the economy isn't going very well because of the war, right? And the government can easily sort of produce this meaning out of nothing. And we see these bizarre sort of Kafkaesque court cases and attacks on ordinary people, sometimes targeted against opposition activists, and sometimes targeted against really very ordinary, very innocent sorts of people as a means of making somebody a scapegoat, right? It's just instilling a little bit of fear and a little bit of uncertainty in the population.
Potentially, you could use this against the Mothers Committee, that not the one that Putin invited into the staged meeting that he had on the edge of Moscow at his residence there, but Mothers Committees, which have been quite good in documenting the losses of Russian soldiers, the equipment that the Russian soldiers don't have, the training that they don't have, and the ridiculous scale of wounded and KIA that the Russian authorities are not releasing properly to the public.
Well, of course, everything you've just listed is now really out of bounds and borderline illegal to talk about, if not actually illegal to talk about.
So I know you follow messaging in Russia, and I was based there for 12 years as a correspondent. I have never seen anything like this. I mean, when I watch some of the programs like Solovyov, and some of it is, I can only describe as some of the most outrageous stuff I've ever seen. But is there a common thread in what I would call hate propaganda? Maybe you'll characterize it as another way, but against NATO, against LGBTQ communities, against Western liberalism, against imaginary Nazis in Ukraine, against anybody now being called traitors if they don't support Putin's war. Is there a thread through all of that you see?
Are you ready to get a little bit theoretical and a little bit digressive from the question? But I think this will get to the heart of what you want to know. The thread that runs through this is the idea, and this is a very neo-fascist idea, that somehow Russia is a fortress that is under attack by all sorts of foreign influences, foreign powers, whether it's NATO that's bad, liberalism, democracy, LGBTQ people, who, of course, even within Russia, seem to be somehow instruments of the West or corrupted by the West, and a desire, therefore, to return to some mythical lost past. And this is what's very scary, I think. The idea that we can somehow make Russia great again, if you'll allow me to borrow an Americanism to understand this, the idea that we can somehow return to a time when Russia was great. But it's not really returning to a real past, because when they talk about the Soviet Union, when they talk about the past under their czars, they're not talking about things that really happened, right? A time that really occurred, because of course the Soviet Union and the Tsarist periods were both brutal and awful places to live for almost everybody except for a select few, right? They're talking about the return to this sort of nostalgic imperial strength when Russia was great and everything was harmonious. There were no attacks on Russia, and if there were, it didn't matter because Russia was somehow strong enough to refuse them. And added to that today is a real ethno-nationalist streak, that this war is really about an image of white Russia and ethnic Russians, and not about a Russian Federation that includes ethnic minorities at all. If they're included, it's only to be used as fodder or as spice to improve, and I read this in a real Russian policy report, spice to spice up the main dish that is Russia itself.
And yet, here they are embracing Chechnya and Kadyrov as kind of their, Putin's tip of the spear in Ukraine, which in many ways, a lot of sort of white ethnic Russians would consider some contradiction.
Well, there is a contradiction here. And the nature of this sort of dreamy mythical logic is that it is inherently irrational. Just as all authoritarian governments have to rely on irrational myths and lies and things that don't make sense to try and prosecute their wars. But in reality, of course, Chechnya itself has been the victim of a very brutal war less than 2 decades ago.
I covered it, and I'm always completely, it's jaw-dropping to me that the Chechens now have rallied behind Putin's war in Ukraine. And not all of them have. In fact, there are Chechen brigades that are fighting on the Ukrainian side, but it's completely, goes against sort of, everything that you would expect after Putin came to power and virtually destroyed Grozny and large parts of Chechnya and killed so many Chechens.
Absolutely. But they rebuilt it as an outpost of empire, and Kadyrov has been a brutal despot for the last 15 years.
So let's talk more about what you've written about in particular, and that is that you've written some really interesting articles on Russian youth. And I have a few young people in my house, and they want to travel, they want to meet people, they want to start businesses, and are Russian youth any different? Are they buying into any of what what the Kremlin is selling so hard that we're under attack from the West? We have to isolate ourselves and fight.
I think in the past that certainly hasn't been necessarily true. The state has really struggled to win over the young population. When we look back to the 2000s and up until about sort of 2014 when Crimea happened, most young Russian people were leaning towards Europe. Now, they weren't sort of raving liberal Democrats by any means. It was a very difficult generation, but people wanted to be open to the world. They wanted to travel. They wanted to live in a more sort of dynamic country where they could do things like open businesses and live comfortably, right? They wanted the middle class dream that, to be honest, most people all around the world seem to want. However, the state over the last decade or so has really pushed hard towards selling a much more ideological form of life, a much more ideological vision to young Russians. And we've seen that in school programs, which have become increasingly, I'm just going to say deranged, because that's the only way to talk about it, and have pushed this idea of fortress Russia hard. And the state has done things like form youth groups, paramilitary youth groups in particular, that I always want to talk about because I find them fascinating and sort of intriguingly dangerous. And at the same time, it's also been attacking its young population, been casting the youth as a source of potential democracy and liberalism, which of course are bywords for Western danger, as a source of sexual and moral corruption, that is queer communities, who are of course another byword for Western danger. And it's been shutting down opportunities for them to access the West, either digitally or in person.
Is this, and I don't like to use parallels with Nazi Germany, because I think they're extreme, but maybe there are some parallels here with the youth movement that was started, in Germany in the late 1930s and through World War II. Are there parallels with the youth movement that is being fertilized by the Kremlin inside Russia?
Well, I think when we look at the biggest youth group, the Youth Army, and these are the little child soldiers you will have seen in the red tops and red berets and khaki pants. This has elements of the Hitler Youth about it. There is an element of focus on physical discipline, firearms training, practical preparation for war, preparation of soldiers, teaching of lessons, singing of songs, summer camps, things like that, that are all designed quite openly to indoctrinate children. And the government is putting more and more money into this and is really determined to make it take off. However, the big difference is the Russian state simply doesn't have the state capacity to build a youth movement that is as strong or as zealous as the Hitler Youth was, for example, where I believe, and somebody is going to tell me that I'm wrong on this, I believe there were 9 million children in the Hitler Youth at its peak. And today the youth army in Russia only has 1 million, and they're hoping to get that to 3 million in the next few years. Now, that's a lot of people, right? That's not an insignificant movement, but that is, significantly smaller than the Hitler Youth.
Yeah, just reading, you wrote, the state is throwing massive political and financial support behind the Youth Army project. It appears to be paying off. Last year, 185 million federal subsidy was announced, and the group is growing rapidly. 1 million children are already members, and enrollment is projected to hit 20% of the school-age population by 2030. So that sounds like that's where you come up with this 3 million figure, is it?
Yes, that's the goal. Now, whether they can reach the goal, whether things will spectacularly fall apart, as they so often do in Russia, we simply don't know. But clearly the state means business, and clearly the people that are pushing this organization, and that is the defense minister Shoigu, this is his pet project. And of course, it has Putin's say so. Any project in Russia does, and such a big project must have real personal weight behind it. If those people could transform this into a much bigger youth movement, then I believe they would. Unlike previous youth movements in Russia, like Nashi, which
I covered
a pretty peripheral movement.
I covered Nashi, and it was peripheral, but it was very much aimed at Putin's expectation that maybe there would be anti-Kremlin forces eventually in the street at some moment, and that he could call on some of these groups that he was bringing along, like Nashi, and they were pretty feverish. They were a youth group. A lot of money was suddenly being thrown at them, and then poof, Nashi ceased to exist. Why is that?
There was internal political wrangling over Nashi. There was sort of Kremlin power struggle, different sectors of power arguing with each other. But I think the key thing to understand about Nashi is that Nashi existed as much as a PR exercise as a real indoctrinating youth group. Many of the people, these sort of kids that were joining the group, didn't really per se join the group, right? They were thugs and hooligans, you know, football hooligans, neo-Nazis, things like that, who would essentially turn up at rallies, be given a t-shirt, be given a ticket into Moscow or some other nice goodie for the day. And they were only Nashi members for as long as the parade or the days going out and beating up anyone who looked queer existed, right? And of course, there were some people within the movement who were much more feverish. I like your word for it. It's a good word for it. But this wasn't the scope of the group as a whole. Now, the youth army, however, is designed to be woven into daily life so that kids experience this from the age of 6 or 7. So we're talking about a much younger demographic to start with. And they will have a youth army group at school. Their parents' employer might sponsor a youth army group. They will see youth army members on the television perpetually. There will be sort of, this will just become a part of life, that paramilitary youth groups are around them and are normalized as something their friends are doing and something they'd like to be a part of too. And that's quite different from Nashi, where unless you're a football hooligan already, for example, you're not really likely to be interested in joining.
I feel like I'm standing on the bridge over a freeway about to watch a collision. And for me, the collision is that in order to bring along those youth movements, Putin taps into, you know, the Great War and the fact that, you know, almost every family was affected somehow by World War II. And the collision seems to me to be this conflict with history, because in the end, is he going to dip back into Stalin's past, who was a brutal leader, who accounted for more deaths on the planet than just about anybody during his rule? Is he going to dip back into that and remake Stalin into somebody that the Russians can now, you know, not eject from their past, but they somehow have to embrace again?
I think you're too late. It's already happening, right? In this sort of mythical historical landscape I'm talking about, anything can be incorporated into history. Anything can be rewritten as being the thing that we wanted it to be. And I'll give you a little story. For my Z Generation book, I interviewed a whole load of Russians who've, you know, grown up over the last 20 years and talked about, well, why did you follow the state, or why did you sort of fall away from the state? And one of the most interesting characters I talked to was a guy called Ivan Kondakov. And he grew up in Arkhangelsk in the 1990s, which was a miserable place to be in the 1990s. And then he moved to Moscow to become a student and did quite well for himself, became an engineer. Now he releases the most bonkers, racist, pro-Putin, anti-Ukrainian music videos you'll have ever seen. And they've been quoted on some of those political discussion shows that we were talking about a few minutes ago. And Ivan told me that the world is made up of two kinds of people: creators and destroyers. And Putin, of course, is a creator. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, they're destroyers because they led to the Russian 1990s, which were a terrible time when everything was collapsing. Putin fixed it, therefore must be a creator. And I asked him about Stalin. I asked, well, what about Stalin? He says, well, Stalin is a creator. Why? Because Stalin made Russia great. Stalin made Russia powerful. Stalin industrialized the country. And of course, naturally, I asked him, what about all the people that died? And he said, well, that can't be real. You know, my jaw was dropping. This is an educated man. He's very, you know, a smart man. A PhD. He's worked on aeroplane engineering, speaks great English, perfect Russian. Yeah. And yet he tells me that can't be real. And then he, at great length, led me through some slightly bonkers statistical accounting explaining how the number of deaths that people say were in the Gulag can't possibly be true.
Well, you know, he might be right, Ian. If you had written a book about that, but in fact, it didn't come from you or me. The most factual accounts of the purges and the bloodshed that was carried out inside Russia came from, Solzhenitsyn and other people inside Russia who wrote about their own stories and their own gulag experiences and what happened. So it's going to be hard for guys like him to deny Russia's past. But I guess it's smoke and mirrors, and the Kremlin's pretty good at it. And Putin's craft as a KGB man is sowing chaos and blowing smoke instead of confronting reality, right?
Of course, but you can go to bookstores in downtown Moscow, downtown Petersburg, and pick up history paperbacks that are really conspiracy theories marketed as history, and that's what people are reading. That's, to be honest, what kids are learning in school. Increasingly, they are learning conspiracy as reality.
Never let the facts get in the way of a good story if you're in the Kremlin. So.
No.
Ian Gardner, I really look forward to your book, and I think these, writing about what's happening inside Russia is so important. So that's Generation Z into the heart of Russia's fascist youth, which will be coming out in the spring, and hopefully we can talk again then when you've already probably put it to paper, but when it's bound and out, and I look forward to talking to you again. And thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you for having me.